Great. We welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is the show where we profile a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. In each episode of this show, we profile and interview a guest who has a unique story to share about how they acquired a set of diverse skills and knowledge in a unique and creative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new definition of learning as conceptualized, narrated, and imagined by the guest on our show. Today's guest is a colleague whose work I've admired professionally for a very long time, Radhika Zahedi. We've known each other professionally for about 4 to 5 years. And just to give the viewers a little background about her work up to now in the field of education, Radhika has been working in the field of education since 2005 and currently serves as the school director at the Green Acres Academy and the center director for the Acres Foundation Center for Teaching and Educational Leadership. She has a wide range of experiences, which include serving as school principal, teacher coach, teacher and curriculum head in a variety of settings, including IB, IGCSE, special needs schools, plus a few short but valuable stints in municipal schools in Mumbai, public schools in New York City, and a rural school in northeast of India. Radhika is passionate about building learning organizations, schools with a culture of continuous learning and innovation filled with empowered leaders, teachers, parents, and students. Radhika has used her decade of experience in the classroom, working directly with students and teachers to champion curricular programs and teacher development that focuses on deep, meaningful learning. Radhika also spent the first 5 years of her career as a high school mathematics teacher, and that's something I'm really excited to talk about. And she has a passion for promoting learning with understanding and learning for all students. In terms of her educational training, she has a master's degree in mathematics education from the Teachers College in Columbia University and a bachelor's degree in engineering from Mumbai University, which is another thing I'm really excited to talk about in terms of how she made that shift. Um, Radhika also writes about education on her wonderful blog. I will be linking that in the show notes here. As the director of the get that name right again, the Acres Foundation Center for Teaching and Educational Leadership. She's constantly designing and implementing professional development resources for teachers. So if there's any teacher listening to this podcast and interview, I highly recommend looking up the foundation's website, but maybe just going through Radhika's blog and looking at all the resources you can find there as a teacher. But Radhika, thank you so much for making time for this. I know that was a slightly long introduction, but I feel it's really important whenever we start this show to give the listeners a background of the person we're interviewing. And because you're a teacher, Radhika, the question I wanted to start with, as a student, Radhika, what were you like growing up as a student? And, what were some of your hobbies? I know you grew up in Mumbai, and I've always been fascinated by how teachers look at themselves as students. And beyond school, what were some of the other hobbies you were interested in, your family influence? So, what was Radhika like as a child growing up?
Sure. So first of all, thanks Abhishek for the opportunity. Really excited to share my experiences. So Radhika, as a child, when I was young, I'm just thinking what if I had to summarize me as a student, I would say I was um, um, master of many, a jack of all trades, but master of none. That was basically who I was. I loved to learn a lot of things, and I did that pretty well. I was pretty good student in school. Teacher, if I was a teacher, I would have loved me as a student. Super compliant and curious, and I had that same curiosity in other areas as well. So arts, music, dance. I played a lot of sports, tennis, table tennis. But I was never. I don't think I could compete or excel at anything, and I was not really a risk taker.
Mhm.
So, and I say this because to give you an example, my husband is the exact opposite of me. He'll do something today, and I think as a kid as well. And like last week, he's like, I want to learn woodworking, and he's like, I'm going to build a guitar. It's
Wow.
like, are you insane? That is not the path to learning woodworking.
Yeah.
And for me, but he does, that's what drives him. And for me, from the time I was a kid, I think it's always been a love for learning, but I've always wanted to enjoy the journey,
Hmm.
so it's very important that the process was enjoyable to me. And I heard Tim Ferriss, and I've been talking about Tim Ferriss a lot with you as well,
Yeah.
because I've been enjoying his podcast. But something he said really like resonated with me, Radhika as a child to Radhika now.
Yeah.
And he said, I like to pick things where even if the outcome is not that great, I have still won,
Got it.
because the process and just the journey is so enjoyable. And I think that's something, that's how I was as a student, um, in all my settings, whether it was sports or academics.
Interesting.
um, yeah.
Yeah. Was there a particular subject that you found really interesting, or you remember some experience in terms of something you learned at school? Again, I think sports is also a great metaphor for life in terms of the skills it teaches you, teamwork, collaboration. So maybe maybe an academic subject and an extracurricular activity that you particularly were fond of growing up, and what that taught you about yourself. Because um, it's interesting to think about how those early inclinations, Radhika, lead to what we decide to choose at university. So I'm thinking about how that early curiosity transferred onto a passion for science and engineering. But was there a teacher that taught you in a particular way, or maybe just an experience in an academic lens and an experience in an extracurricular lens for us?
Sure. I'll start with academics. So I was in, I mean, this is the 80s, 90s. I was in one of these massive convent schools, all girls. In my grade, there were 300 kids, 50 to 60 kids in a class. It was like one of those, public-private partnerships. So like the fees were really diverse, really, really rich kids and really, really, low socioeconomic, populations as well. So it was a really nice, diverse group. But I would say like the education at that point, honestly, was quite uninspiring in those settings. And so I think I was one of those fortunate few who just somehow enjoyed learning incidentally on my own. I
Wow.
don't think there was like a moment where a teacher introduced me to something, and that blew my mind away. And I know many of my friends that were put off from learning through the same experiences. But in that process, I was never a reader as a kid. I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to say now reading is one of my most favorite things to do. But as a child, somehow I never picked up reading.
Okay.
And so I wasn't like those kids who have like this wealth of knowledge as kids and are making connections. And so I was curious to learn, but then as I discovered mathematics and science, especially physics, I found myself being drawn to those subjects more than others,
Wow. Okay.
because I was just amazed by how much problem solving you could do with just a few foundational principles,
Mm-hmm.
like these few laws, rules, and you just apply them to different settings, and you're able to solve this whole like class of problems, right? Which
True.
which didn't feel like the same thing in the other disciplines like the humanities or languages. Um, and so I just had a natural affinity to maths and science. Everything about those two disciplines, fascinated me. Um, so I think academically, those were things I was passionate about.
Wow.
And outside of academics, I loved sports.
Okay.
I think I don't think I think sports has a tremendous potential to develop grit
Yeah.
in children, but I don't think I developed grit in sports. And I think I also had a bit of a fixed mindset, which in hindsight now I can recognize. But what sports did teach me, so I absolutely despised competition.
Mm.
I competed, but it tore me down. But what I did love in sports was the community, and it taught me a lot about relationships and using teams to learn from and to again enjoy the process.
Mm.
So that was another thing, and of course the arts. I grew up in this little bubble in Bandra, very close knit community, and arts was very central to everything we did as children.
Wow.
It was not uncommon to hear every floor playing loud music on a Saturday or Sunday, dance, music. I remember at my family parties, someone would just, start on the piano or with a guitar, and everyone was singing. It was part of the culture, like singing along was what they did at a party.
Yeah.
And I think I have a very, very strong connection to the creative arts that still lives on to today. And I think in all the schools I've also been an advocate or a champion for developing arts programs. I don't think
Wow.
I've reached my goals yet, but definitely developed that passion early on in my childhood.
That's wonderful. I love how you articulated, or just shared those experiences, Radhika. Like I remember, like I have the same experience as you in terms of reading. I never read a lot as a kid because I didn't really understand the reasons to do that. But there was a time in grade 11 when a teacher realized I like sports, and for some reason she took an interest in me and gave me a couple of books about sports people. And that was the first time in my life I realized you could read books about things you're interested in. And for some reason, she kept pushing books down whatever. I kept asking her, I'm interested in this sport, I'm interested in this sport. And then I realized that you can use reading to understand about the things you're interested in rather than just read because you want to score well at school or impress somebody. And, unfortunately, I didn't have the same mentorship for math and physics. And for a lot of people that I went to a CBSE school, and just to break down the Indian education system, I grew up in the Middle East, but a lot of the South Asian community over there went to schools that were affiliated to the Indian board. So you have private boards like CBSE and ICSE, and then you have the public system in every state as well. So I went to a CBSE school, and there was a lot of emphasis on the maths and sciences, and my parents pushed me to take up the engineering field. And I was always scared of math and science because I always knew they would judge me and judge my potential. So I ran as far away from that as possible. And I wish it was different, but as a child, you're always scared of judgment, right, Radhika? And I think that's where I came from. And as a teacher, I'm trying to break out of those notions, but it's just super interesting to see your story and your journey and how it went just the other way. And I think
Yeah,
you were, no, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, no,
As you're talking, I feel like I literally had the exact opposite experiences of as you did, because
yeah,
as a kid, my mom, poor thing, she used to say, read, it's so important, it's so important. But they weren't readers either. So I
yeah,
never saw them reading, and I never authentically took to it.
yeah,
And I actually became a reader in my 30s. That's how late I discovered reading. I feel huge sense of FOMO for the first 2 decades of my life.
yeah.
But my daughter is 7, and she's just finished all 7 Harry Potter books. And
You
I
have,
feel like I have attained victory as a parent. At least she genuinely loves reading. And
yeah.
that was like my one parenting goal. So that, and it's interesting about the math and science. I did engineering too, as you
Yeah,
mentioned earlier, but my parents and the community around me, no one, very few people pursued like a heavy academic track, engineering or medicine. My parents almost never said like you should do medicine. They were like, do whatever you want.
sure.
So, and I was one of the few people who actually landed up pursuing engineering in my immediate sort of community around me. So it almost felt like the exact opposite experience as you had.
No, and it's interesting. We also take a lot of our own teaching experiences into our teaching practice, right? And that's something to be mindful and conscious of. Is do you have a particular mindset with a subject, and is that something you are taking into the classroom? Because now, as an elementary teacher, I'm teaching math, science, English, and I want to make sure they, just as you as a parent, with the students you're working with, you want to make sure they have the best possible experience possible. But I'm curious about, because growing up in India, there most of our learning is structured into larger streams, and very early on in high school, we are often made to take a decision between the arts, commerce, and the sciences. And I don't know if it was the same for you, but there is, and sometimes you feel some sort of pressure in terms of there being a hierarchy, in terms of certain subjects being placed on a pedestal and certain other subjects not being given as much importance. But what was your experience in high school and university like, in terms of your exposure to those subjects, and just in terms of how it opened your thinking? And even beyond that, what were you considering in terms of your long-term career goals? I'm curious about that phase between high school, university, and your first professional years, Radhika.
You're absolutely right. We had those streams: science, commerce, arts. My time it was just three. Now at least they have a few more. But I think that is one of the biggest and most important changes we have to make to the system. Kids are still having to choose in today's day and age where there's absolutely no need.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Having said that, I do find myself advising kids who are absolutely unsure of what to do.
Yeah.
And I guess this again comes from my personal experience, right? Because if you don't know what to do, but you pursue an arts stream, you are limited with your choices beyond that.
Correct. Yeah.
But for example, me, I pursued engineering
Yeah.
because I just enjoyed the subjects, of course. So that's a different thing. And I wanted to pursue that. But I really was able to, I worked as a software engineer after that, and I had absolutely no problem transitioning into the education space.
True.
So I think that is a very practical aspect. It's not ideal. And I do find myself telling kids, you know what, right now, if you can, try and keep your options open, but don't, of course, torture yourself and go into like a science field if you absolutely hate it. But,
True.
and the other thing that complicates it is most of the Indian curricula, at least in the state and, these boards, the curriculum is not representative of what knowledge they need to know for the future.
Mm.
So it's not even like your, I truly believe everybody needs to know math, science, history, languages. Uh, they're all critical to any job that you sort of, or any career that you want to pursue, right? In different ways,
True.
even the arts.
True.
But
Yeah.
the way that the curriculum teaches them, I have, apart from it building my rational thinking, I don't think any of the science or engineering knowledge that I acquired in my education, I had a practical use for. You
Interesting. Okay.
know, what those things did for me, I told you, sports didn't really build grit, but engineering, my 4 years in my engineering experience, it really exposed me to gritty learners. you
Mm-hmm.
know uh, they really knew how to stay focused and were just great at learning. So I think that's something I saw and I was inspired by in many ways, even though they may not have, may have been for a very short term outcome, getting a good grade, but it was still something to admire.
Interesting.
Um, and yeah, and as I did in school, the things that interested me, I picked up sort of on my own, and I was a like nerdy kid, so I always attended classes, but the curriculum, the experience was not super inspiring,
Got it.
and I don't think it had an inspiring effect on any of my peers. You know.
Got it. Good.
Yeah.
And during that time at university, what branch of engineering were you studying, Radhika?
So again, great. Which brings me to another point.
Yeah.
Kids, at least my time, and I have a feeling it still is the case in India, at least, and I'm
Yeah.
sure it's different around the world. But kids are not taught to think about long-term goals or just about goals.
Yeah.
They're taught about to think about which stream you want and then what you want next. And sometimes they are taught to think about what profession do you want to pursue. Do you want to be a doctor, engineer, teacher, right? But kids need to be thinking about what like impact they want to make in the world, or what difference, that's the kind of goal setting you want them to do, and then the paths to that can be so different, right?
True.
So for me, of course, I had to choose. My thought process was, what do you want to pursue? Okay, you're great at math and science, you love it. Medicine or engineering? I prefer physics and math. I'll go for engineering because I hate chemistry and I really don't want to be remembering a lot of chemistry. And I think about it now, I think I would have loved medicine as a profession too, but just like the thought process was so narrow at that time, that I chose engineering. I loved engineering too, so I loved a lot of things, but I loved engineering, just the subjects
Yeah.
too. And there wasn't really, I wasn't thinking about like what I wanted to do with my knowledge and what impact. I think it was a very like short. I was super short-sighted and just took one step at a time. Whatever opportunities were there, I worked hard and I pursued those. I studied biomedical engineering,
Okay.
and again, why? Because I loved biology and I loved math and physics, and that
Yeah.
was the intersection of all. But when I did the course, I hated it.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it was, right?
Yeah.
So again, I think because I took choices that kept my options open, I got lucky.
Sure.
My first 2 years, I loved it because those were generic tracks for all students. And then
Got
when
it.
I specialized into the biomedical stuff, I hated what I was doing. And
Yeah.
I was lucky that even in spite of that, I could get a job because they do give you some sort of software, computers sort of foundation. I got a job in a software company in what I realized what I wanted to pursue.
Got it.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
And that's really, you made so many important points there, Radhika. The flexibility is there one way. For instance, if you choose science, you can go into commerce and arts. But if you choose arts, it's very
yeah,
difficult to make the transition to commerce and science. And that is unfortunate for so many students, right? And I also think the point you made about the number of students in your class, and I have, both of us are teachers, and I have immense respect for the profession and the amount of workload that we give teachers, right? If you have a class with 45 students and you have a class with 15 students, the quality of instruction is going to be significantly different, and that is something people don't realize, especially when you're not in the classroom, because the amount of individual attention you can give a child, and a lot of people fall through, the holes. Like some students like you that were motivated are able to find your path because you have some additional support, or fortunately you have the learning skills to go through that system, but there will be a lot of students that will take mindsets that they acquire at school into the rest of their life. They will always say that I'm not a math person, I don't read, I don't like science because it's so confusing, and I don't like science because I did bad on a grade 10 math test, when there shouldn't be any connection between the two, because science is not just for scientists, right?
yeah,
Science
exactly.
is for you to understand the world better. And it's amazing to think about how you can develop a newfound connection for these subjects when you start looking at it from that perspective, and there's no fear of a grade, sort of blocking you from that vision. But you also mentioned something about the structure of learning experiences in those settings. And, I'm curious about the transition that you made mentally and how you went about doing that. Because as a teacher, I know you get lots of opportunities to talk about what it's like to be a teacher. But I'm also curious about Radhika as the learner. Like you mentioned that experience of being a learner in your 30s, but very early on, you had to make that professional shift from, and I know at this time you also took up a volunteering teaching experience at a local municipal school in Mumbai. So what was that phase of your life like, Radhika, in terms of working, as a software engineer, as an engineer, and also doing these volunteering or full-time jobs? I'm sorry, I'm not very, but then how did that lead to the decision of doing a master's in mathematics education, which is super focused and super directed? I'm just curious how that phase in your life led to that.
Yeah, great question. While I was an engineering student, I well, first of all, I was always somebody who, when I was in it, I would do enough so that I was getting the learning, but I would never do anything to get that full, like that 99%. I could never be somebody who excelled just for topping the exam. I could just do enough so that I would be consistent and, not have what they call KTs, allowed to keep turns if you lose if you fail an exam. So I would never be in that zone. And even in my 12th grade, I don't know if you know this or if you remember, but it was similar. But when people choose science in grade 12 here, they go to colleges that don't expect them to attend so they can just cram for exams.
Mm.
And I had friends who have like 2% attendance, 3% attendance. I had 89% attendance that year because I was just there to learn.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I must have had the highest attendance in the whole college. So that was kind of who I was. And during that time, like I said, I pursued a lot of things that I enjoyed. One of the things I found myself really enjoying was, and there are a couple of reasons for this, was teaching kids. So
Mm.
while I was in engineering, I used to go on weekends to volunteer at, this is before I joined the municipal school. So I would go on Saturday and Sunday, and they used to have this school in a bus on like Carter Road on the seaside. And I would teach there every Saturday and Sunday.
Ah,
Really enjoyed that experience. I was a terrible teacher. I'm pretty sure I taught the kids nothing now that I look back, but I had some camaraderie with them. So that experience sort of went on for 2 years on the side.
got it.
In addition to that, my passion for dance. I also had a short stint as a dance teacher
Ah,
with as a salsa instructor.
okay.
So after I graduated from college and I was working as a software engineer, I would come back on weekends, and every weekend I would teach dance to
Okay.
adults. And those two experiences brought me so much joy. Just the process of teaching them, it was just seeing people learn what I was teaching them was just really fulfilling to me. So that kind of stuck in my head. Um, and I'm going to skip back to an one important sort of experience from my childhood. My parents, my dad in particular, did something. He always made us. I mean, we were fairly privileged, not like super rich or whatever, but fairly privileged. And always made us very aware of our privilege and very aware of inequity around us. And he would
Mm-hmm.
do sometimes really like ridiculous things. He would take us to a really fancy dinner, and we would eat, a great meal. And then he would completely ruin the meal by saying, "Everybody look at the bill. I think this is more than this person's salary, and this." And at that moment, I would be so pissed off because we didn't even ask him to take us out for dinner. He
Yeah.
chose the place,
Yeah.
but he would do. I mean, he would do these things which at that time seemed super annoying, but
Yeah.
they did make me very aware of my privilege and the inequity around me everywhere, right? And in Mumbai, it's everywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think these three things combined, sort of, while I was in Infosys, I was working in Infosys as a software engineer, um, sort of made me it's lingering. It was lingering there, and I wasn't having very inspiring experiences in Infosys also. I think it was because it was a massive company. And I too wasn't, honestly, it wasn't all them. I don't think I was so focused. Like I said, right? I learned how to work hard, but I hadn't learned how to think strategically, or I wasn't even sure about what I wanted to create as a software engineer.
Got it. Yeah.
And then about that time, I met my husband, who was also in a similar space. And when we started talking, we both realized we wanted to do something that was socially impactful. And we both started talking about education.
Mm-hmm.
So after 2 years working is when I sort of decided to take a plunge and leave that job. But I realized two things along with him. One is I really don't know anything about education, so I need to um, get an education myself to learn how to impart education to others.
Sure.
And the second thing is I said I need to really first, before taking the plunge, I need to figure out really if this is for me. So that's when I quit as a software engineer after 2 years, and I applied to a small little, the public-private partnerships when
Yep.
NGO was running a municipal school.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked there for 1 year as a fifth and sixth grade teacher. It was amazing experience, eye-opening. Again, there I feel like I taught the kids nothing.
Hmm.
I made just really good friendships, and they were, we had a great relationship, positive environment, but no actual academic learning. But that was enough for me. That, along with my teaching experiences, was enough for me to say, okay, I think I need to dive into this. And then I applied to Columbia and got into
And
that.
that's wonderful, Radhika. I really like how rather than just reading about education, you actually you went into a classroom and looked at what that was like, and that's a great thing. I mean, that's a model that more people can actually learn from. If there's a particular field or endeavor you're interested in, maybe go and try a volunteer experience or a short time internship in that particular space to help you understand more if that is something you would be
Yeah.
comfortable with. But I really like that point you made about being a salsa instructor or just teaching on the weekends. And sometimes we think that teaching and learning happens only in the classroom, but it's all around us. In our free time, we're always learning new things. Some of us learn how to play the guitar, some of us learn how to play a new sport, some of us learn how to dance. And even in those cycles, I mean, teachers know terms like summative, diagnostic, formative, but
Yeah.
instructors follow the same model of, first understanding where you're at, then constantly giving you some formative feedback, and then maybe doing a performance to actually share your learning. But it was really interesting. I mean, I really like how you shared that experience. But, in terms of, and also that decision of just quitting one career and starting another, I think you mentioned bits about your parents influence and your partner's influence too, and I think that is something that is very sorry, underrated in terms of our growth in the long term, because both our parents are the first models of adults. Or if you have I mean, the guardian or the parent, we look at them and the profession they have, and that becomes our set model of what an adult should be like, not just professionally, but also emotionally. And
Right.
uh,
Absolutely.
and I think those conversations you had with your dad and your mom and maybe your other guardians and your partner as well, I mean, in some way could have led to that decision of, or that very scary decision of moving to another country and
Yeah.
pursuing this path. But I mean, again, India, the US, education is completely different. So, at Columbia, I mean, it's one of the best education like teachers colleges in the world. It is called the Teachers College at Columbia University. What was your experience learning about education there like, and what did it change about your thinking, and what did it expand in terms of what you already saw in India?
Uh, so I went to teachers college with a year of experience in sort of an almost semi-structured setting, right? Because there's no professional development, there's no induction,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And it just blew my mind away. I was just hearing so many new things about teaching and learning. Just first of all, just like an evidence-based approach
Yeah.
to teaching. The fact that there's so much knowledge out there, the way people think about curriculum. I was learning math or seeing math suddenly in a way that I hadn't seen it before. Even though I was so passionate about it, and I was seeing the limitations of my own educational experiences all in that 1 year. And so it fired me up. And honestly, I think that's what it did. It just opened my mind to so many things. It made me recognize what I had suspected, that I really don't know enough anything about teaching. Because you have a tendency. I know many people have a tendency, and I know I had that as well before. That you know, I'm a smart person. I learn things well. I know I'm going to be pretty good at teaching if I just put my head to it, right?
Sure.
And I went there and I realized that look, yes, that's something you can do,
Hmm.
but there is expertise related to this field and a lot of it.
Hmm.
And another interesting thing, I have this conversation with a lot of young people today who are looking to study, and they reach out for advice. And I went really early with very little experience. And so I feel, though it opened my mind dramatically to so many things, I feel like I was absorbing like 30% of the courses, because my own experience was so um, small before that.
Mm.
and in such a unique setting. Whereas I feel like if people have worked 2 or 3 years in a school, they're able to process all the information at a much deeper level. So there are definitely advantages for me going in so early, because when I came back, I had like a lifetime of information that I needed to test and try and learn from. But
Yeah,
I do think a lot might have been lost on me during that course, because it was all so new and I was hearing so much of it for the first time.
sure.
Whereas if you go later, it's a different thing, but you might find some of the things too basic also.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like you made some, again, some really good, important points there, Radhika, and I feel like you also realize how much you don't know when you start studying a subject that you're really interested in. And also as a teacher, your first, and you very humbly stated that your first 2 or 3 years, you're just figuring things out. You're not really sure what is happening. You don't know where things are going. But I know right after your experience at that university, you came back and started working as a math teacher in an IGCSE school here in Bombay. You did that for 5 years, and then you worked at a special needs school for 5 years in the role of a math coach, and then in an administrative position. And this decade of your life, over 10 years of teaching and admin, I mean, I'm just so intrigued by everything you saw on the ground as a teacher. But the reason I am intrigued by it is because I read an article that you had written earlier, where you spoke about something you designed, a more project based approach to learning math, where you wanted to teach the students. Um, I think it was
Area.
about measurement and area, and you actually made them design a space. I
Yeah.
think their classroom setting where they could transfer what they're learning into class in the class into like a real world project. And I
Yeah.
think that approach was just amazing, because I think just the amount of time you spent designing that sort of strategy would have made that concept so clear, and they would have enjoyed it because they saw it in the real world, right? So I'm thinking about these 10 years in your life, Radhika. Maybe you can start off chronologically. I don't know if you remember. I know there's so much you've gone through, but and also you don't have to share students names because we want to protect privacy, and even the institutions or the teachers names. But if you could just talk about certain things you saw, you did, and you experienced in this 10-year period, that would be really, really interesting for us to hear. And
Like you're absolutely right. I think as an educator, it's been a transformation. Like when I think about what I knew 10 years ago and what I knew now, completely different people. I think my first experience, those 5 years, they really, they, that experience gave me a couple of really, really important things. I think the first thing, it gave me a very real, authentic teacher experience.
mhm,
And that has stuck with me a lot, because my previous 1 year stints, they're not the same as a 4 or a 5 year stint, because it's only after 1 or 2 years where you're given enough responsibility by the school and you have a full load to experience all of the things, positive things, where you get to be a master in the actual stuff that you're teaching. So in year 1 you can't cope with everything, but by
yeah,
year 3 when you teach that same thing, your classes are a whole new world.
yeah,
At the same time, you also experience things like burnout, and when you want to do more interesting stuff, you might have systemic sort of blocks. But it really gave me a teacher experience, and till today, like right now, I'm not teaching a class in my new role. I feel like I have a great understanding of the teacher experience because of that. And I have many arguments with a few of my colleagues who've done 1 year stints or they've not really done. I'm like, listen, you don't understand. You have to be doing it for 4 or 5 years to really understand what they're going through and what they can do. So I think that was really powerful. The second thing was the IB curriculum. It blew me away again, and in a different way. Like when I did my masters, it was more around learning theories and what studies tell us about what works and doesn't work, etc. But IB showed me what the power of a fantastic curriculum can do.
mhm,
Um, Learning was so rich. One, it transformed my understanding of the disciplinary stuff, the mathematics, just by being a great curriculum. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the PD, and it was just me studying the curriculum and trying to impart that to my kids. So I'm a huge fan of the IB to this day, even though I'm not currently in an IB school. But that was something that has had a massive impact on my understanding of curriculum, that 5 year experience. And one small but still important point, the principal in that school, um, I learned something very important from her. I was young, and for some reason, she trusted me and she gave me a lot of autonomy. And I
Mm-hmm.
see that that doesn't happen in a lot of places. There's a lot of standardization, and it's for whatever reason.
Sure.
But that really allowed my passion for education to keep the fire going rather than me feeling like a burnt out feeling. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing I've taken from her. So I think these are like sort of the key learnings from that experience. Of course, many more smaller ones, and just community was amazing there as well.
Yeah.
That's one thing I feel. For the most part, I feel education community is just such a cute community.
It
Like
is.
everybody
Yeah.
is really nice and sweet. And you see these shows, like I've been watching like the morning show recently, the
Yeah.
Apple. I'm like, I can't relate to those workplaces because education is just it's sweet, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that was the first school, and then of course when I went to the special ed school, um, I, I wasn't planning to be there for so long. I wasn't actually super excited about making a switch to special education at that time because it's like, oh my god, this is going to be it's going to derail me. My
Yeah.
husband was the head of school at that time, so
And it
it's
was
like, no, we
it's a
need
whole
you to
different
come.
skill set, right, Radhika, in
Yeah,
terms of what the
totally. So
students need. Yeah.
and I was like, I don't think I have the knowledge, one, and I don't want to get sort of boxed into another. I mean, that's how I looked at it, right?
Sure.
And he said, just come for 2 years, help us with the math program, and then you can go. So went in with that intention.
Sure.
But that again, I feel like every experience has completely shifted my perspective on really key areas of learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, first big thing in the special education school was I always was a supporter of inclusion, special ed, but I think I was always a very rational supporter.
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was right. I knew that's that needed to be done. How can I not be a supporter? When I went there and I met all of these children with many different, like let's say, atypical needs, I met the parents and I saw the challenges they had to face on a day-to-day basis, but with education, with the system, and how things sort of compounded in different areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that experience just turned me into a advocate for inclusion, but with my whole heart,
Got it.
and that is going to be with me for the rest of my life. So
Mm.
that's one really big thing because I actually made, when you meet someone with special needs and maybe one day that's a different thing than having a proper relationship with them, right? And then it's amazing. Um, and sometimes just meeting kids for a day doesn't allow you to see their full personalities, right? For
Yeah.
all kids.
Yeah.
So I think that was a really big shift in my perspective. Um, so that's one big thing. The second thing actually this school taught me is not limited just to special education,
Mm-hmm.
but it made me see learning again in a completely different light.
Mm.
Because you go to college and they talk about like learning theories and like constructivism and all these things, but here I had to go back 3 levels. I had to I became so aware of sensory motor processing and its impact on learning, which we just completely take for granted, right?
Sure.
Like our vision or our hearing. Sometimes I met kids who, if a label on the back of their neck was itching them, their system gave them such a big alarm that they just couldn't do anything else,
Mm.
right? So I saw this whole other world of sensory processing. I also saw how socio-emotional uh, stuff can interfere very explicitly, like anxiety, anger issues, not being able to self-regulate. So that was another big thing that I saw. And
Yeah.
of course, physiological as well, right?
Yeah.
So like you have a hearing thing that people don't realize, and they attribute it to not paying attention, but it's actually you're not able to hear properly,
Yeah.
but the kid didn't realize it. So uh, that also like sort of just really opened my mind and made me realize how complex learning is, and sometimes we look at it so narrowly. So I really value that knowledge that sort of I acquired, and how you can actually, these things don't have to be acquired implicitly by kids. So
Yeah.
not just if you have a socio emotional need, but all kids should be taught um, how to be socially aware, self-aware, how to regulate, how to manage your emotion, how to make good decisions.
Mm,
Right? That's something all shouldn't expect them to learn that implicitly.
sure.
So I think this was a really big thing, and of course, it gave the last thing was that school gave me uh, sort of sweetly threw me into a whole school leadership role, which I am so grateful for, because I didn't know that I would love it so much, but I see this as being my thing. Like I love it so much because there's so much opportunity, um, so much that can be done in
Yeah.
this kind of a role.
Yeah.
So that was the third experience I got there, and because it was a very safe and sweet community, supportive. Like I said, I'm not a risk taker. All my big risks were had to be supported by community, and I had to feel really safe. So this is what sort of it allowed me to do there.
Yeah, and we're really lucky to have you in that position now, Radhika, because I think you can do really wonderful, amazing things in that role. And just in terms of supporting other teachers, other parents, and many more students just beyond the classroom, I think it's just good for education in general that you are in that sort
I
of
hope so.
space.
I'm glad you think so. I
But
really hope.
yeah, Radhika, like something I'm really curious about, Radhika, is, if you had all the resources in the world, okay, and everything was just perfect, what would your ideal classroom look like? Because I know you have like a leadership and administration role, and there are so many blocks and so many barriers, and again, I think your experience and something I just wanted to point out is it's so beautiful that you had so much time in that school. And in our school, the school I work in now, we work with a lot of students that are on IEPs that need the additional support. And I know that we often say that that's the one thing they're not good at, but they're good at so many different other things. And it's so important to not look at a child based on the label they're given, but also look at all their other potential. But coming back to our question about if you had all the resources in the world, what would Radhika's ideal classroom and school community look like?
Okay, so just because of where I am right now professionally, I'm going to ask you if I can tweak that question a
Sure.
little,
Sure. Go
because
ahead.
I'm in a space where or my team and all of us, we're sort of on this. The reality about education is that most people don't have all the resources in the world,
Correct.
and that's what makes the educational challenge so complex, right? It's not only about what we know and can do in theory or want to achieve, right? And I feel
True.
like that's what I'm spending the next 5 or 10 years trying to figure out. It's this value innovation. How do we give this really high quality education that schools maybe that charge really like I'm talking about Mumbai, like 7, 8, 9, 10 lakhs, and that's what allows them to afford a 1:15, 20 ratio, um, to schools that charge less than, let's say, a lakh and have 40 kids in a class. Like
Yeah.
for me, I feel that's the
The wicked
that's
problem, right? The big
yes,
design
yes,
thinking
the wicked,
sort of.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'm in that setting. Like what you were getting at earlier, right, is so
Yeah.
important in today's day and age. Um, Standardization can only go so far, right? Like I
True.
think there is definitely value
There's no, I mean,
ensuring.
I think what you're getting at, Radhika, is there's no one perfect model, right? There's going to be different models in different contexts. But I mean, what
Yes.
would your approach, if I had to tweak that question, what would your approach be? Again, it's not something you know completely right now, but which direction do you think your thinking would go in
Yeah.
if you had to solve that wicked problem using design thinking? And I know in your blog you have this wonderful conceptual model of explaining things, and I love how you do that. But how would you go about solving that problem in
So
the
I
next
think
10
I'm going
years?
to take from I think one of the blogs sort of, I put it out there in a very, very semi confusing manner because I still am trying to figure it out. But I think this there's some things from the old school, not exactly how we did it, but with improvements, top down approach, like this systematic approach that is still valuable.
Hmm.
Like having rigorous learning standards for all, right? Because you can't just take kids or tell schools, hey, teach whatever you want, because you'll have some amazing schools, but you'd also have some schools and teachers that aren't really doing a good job, right? And then equity goes out of the window. So I feel like there is a role for like standards, there is a role for rich curriculum, there is a role for these top down like improvement science approaches to school improvement
Sure.
on one end. And then I think on the other end, the challenge is about the learner-centered approaches. Like
Sure.
at the end of the day, it is a human-centered environment. That's what makes it challenging, right? You can't just approach it like a tech organization. Uh, there are individual learners, and I think that learner-centered sort of approach will happen with a couple of things. Um, One is the recognition that teachers always play a critical role. So I don't think tech is going to completely like knock the teachers out. Two is, as you were saying earlier, like the system itself should recognize that every learner is an individual, right? So have you heard of multi-tiered systems of support, which
I'm
basically
familiar with it, but I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
well, that emerged from a special ed setting, but actually it really applies to, I think, every school ever for all kinds of learners. Basically, the idea is that look, at a systems level, you should also have a systematic approach to deciding how much support you can give kids, so that all your kids have the needs that they require, and that means that at a first tier, everyone should have a high quality base education, and like 80%, 85% of the kids will get what they need.
Got it.
And then you have a system for looking at 15% who might need a little bit more over and above this. And then you have that small percent that may need like just IEPs and all, because this foundation is not working. So I feel
Hmm.
like this synergy of like top down plus learner centeredness has to happen.
Interesting.
And I think what's new or what's exciting about today is technology can enable us to do that at scale.
Hmm.
So for example, you talk about those how they do assessments and sort of for like my teachers have 100 kids they're working. How are they going to do PBL, project based learning, with 150 kids? How are they going to do assignments and give feedback to 150 kids, right?
Yeah.
But when you have technology in the mix that helps them do some amount as like automated grading, asynchronous responses, organizing data to help you see, hey, these kids really need help. This 50% is fine, let them go ahead.
Yeah.
Maybe just need. So I feel like we're in a space where we can actually now realize these things at scale. So I think my sort of focus was the scale thing. And I'm sure many schools can do much more fantastic stuff in the classroom. Um, uh, but that's not yet the challenge. I feel like these schools, big schools, will get there maybe in 5 years.
Sure.
So for me, this is sort of what I think needs to be done. This top down plus bottom up sort of synergy with tech leveraging for scale.
Yeah, yeah, I really enjoyed reading that particular blog post, and I think you've really explained how that can be done, because I think it's not, and that's the problem a lot of us probably did in the past, where we assume that we have a perspective, and our perspective is the only way to solve this complex challenge, and then you realize that it's such a large problem with so many stakeholders involved that there can't be a single solution, but it's got to be a conversation. And I think how you framed it in terms of a partnership between a more top-down approach to a more learner-centric approach is a good balance of perspectives, where you constantly not only have to understand the school community you work in, but also the parents and the students that you're working with, and maybe design solutions that work in your unique context. And I'm very excited for the writing and all the videos you're going to be putting out in the next 10 years. And hopefully in 10 years time, we have more of those, wonderful solutions. But I really enjoyed this conversation, Radhika. Thank you so much for making time for this. And, one thing, I wanted to end this on a positive note. So if Radhika had to write a little letter to the teacher that started teaching 10 years ago, what would some things be? What would you tell her in terms of advice? And this is also for a lot of young people like me, taking up teaching as a profession in the long term. What are one or two things you'd tell us to do, looking ahead at the future of education from your eyes?
That's tough question. But at least telling myself, I think it would be the things that you did well were uh, dive into the experiences and work hard and make the most of your experiences in the education. The things that I wish you would have done is realize very early on that there's a wealth of information now out there to improve your improve anything that you set your sort of heart on.
Sure.
I think I developed all my leadership skills just by following like all my mentors online and reading their material, right? So I think that's the second one. Keep learning, keep looking. And I think the third thing is keep remembering that education is a complex um, challenge,
Hmm.
and all of us, all anyone who wants to solve it should go in with an open mind, should not go in with the mentality it's very easy to blame other stakeholders and feel like somebody else in the mix is doing something wrong, but if you realize it's super complicated, it's not really their fault, it's just a complicated problem to solve. So a more open minded, collaborative, solution oriented sort of approach
Sure.
is going to get us all, I think, a long way ahead if we do that. So I think those are the three things I would tell myself.
No, thanks, Radhika. That's wonderful, and I think that's a great note to end this show. And thank you for sharing your story so honestly and so vulnerably, but also so powerfully. And I hope to maybe get a chance to interview 3 years down the line, and maybe 6 years down the line. And I think we'll have a whole new set of insights and stories to hear from you at that point too. But thank you again for your work as a teacher and as a school leader. And for everyone listening, stay tuned for more such episodes in the near future. And I will be linking Radhika's blog in the show notes. I highly recommend reading her wonderful posts on teaching and learning, but also reaching out to her on social media to understand her work better. Thank you so much. And until next time, keep learning. Thank you, Radhika.
Thanks, Abhishek. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm just going to